Hi everyone and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So in the previous videos we talked about the visual system and the auditory system. So we talked about the anatomy of the eye and the ear and the visual pathways and auditory pathways into the brain. So in this video we are going to cover somatosensation. So these are the body senses. The body senses can be split up into four submodalities. So we have nociception, apsis, proprioception, and balance. And then we're going to talk about the somatosensory pathways. So these are the spinothalamic tracts, and we have a posterior one and an anterior one. And they're a little bit different. And then lastly, we are going to talk about the vestibular system, which is then important for the fourth submodality, balance. These are connected. So sensory receptors transduce energy into action potentials, and that's something I keep repeating because I definitely want you guys to remember that. The somatosensory system has more than one way of doing so. So let's go over an example. I have a picture here from the book. So here, for example, if you get touched or by a feather or by anything else, your hair will be displaced. So this will cause stretch-sensitive channels on dendrites to open, and that will make sodium influx into the cell. And then when this sodium goes into the cell, voltage sensitive sodium and potassium channels will open and they will produce an action potential. So somatosensory, our somatosensory system is where mechanical energy or pressure activates mechanoreceptors that generate action potentials. So in nociception, whenever there's tissue damage, it releases neurotransmitters that activate pain fibers and produce action potentials. Okay, so vision and hearing are exteroceptive systems, and the somatosensory system, it technically literally means body awareness. So it has an exteroceptive function, but it also has interoceptive functions where it monitors the internal bodily events and the information that goes to the brain about positions of body segments relative to one another and about body and space. So 3 of the 4 major somatosensory submodalities mediate our perception of sensations such as pain or touch and also body awareness. So the fourth one is composed of a set of interoceptive receptors within the inner ear and mediate balance. Okay, so the 4 major submodalities are nociception, which is the perception for unpleasant stimuli such as pain, temperature, and itch. Then we have apsis, which is the perception of fine touch and pressure. Proprioception, the perception of body location and movement. And the vestibular system, which is really important for balance. Okay, so let's start off with nociception or nocioception. Nociception technically means noxious perception. So it is the perception of pain, temperature, and itch. Most nociceptors consist of free nerve endings, and when they're damaged or irritated, these endings will secrete chemicals such as peptides that stimulate the nerve, and that will produce action potentials that then convey messages about pain or temperature or itch towards the brain or towards the central nervous system. So pain is not perceived until it hits the cortex in the brain, and pain is necessary. So sometimes people are born without pain receptors, but those people are often subject to body deformities through failure to adjust posture or due to acute injuries through failure to avoid harmful situations. So here you can see these little nociceptors, as they're like little free nerve endings right here in the skin. Their response is very slow, and they respond to either damage or irritation of surrounded cells. So many internal organs, including our heart, have pain receptors. However, the ganglion neurons that carry the information from these receptors don't have pathways directly to the brain. So instead, they synapse with spinal cord neurons that receive nociceptive information from the body's surface. So because of that, the neurons in the spinal cord can relay pain, temperature, and itch messages that the brain receives in 2 sets of signals. So one of these signals will come from the body surface, and the other set of signals will come from the internal organs. So these spinal cord neurons cannot distinguish between the two sets of signals, and we cannot distinguish them either. So because of that, pain in organs inside of the body is felt as referred pain. So it comes from the surface of your body. An example of this is pain in your heart. So for example, during a heart attack, it is often felt in the left shoulder and in the left upper arm. And then for example, pain in the kidneys, you'll feel that in your lower back. Okay, moving on to hapsis. So hapsis is a Greek word for touch, and hapsis is literally our tactile perception of objects. So haptic receptors enable fine touch, pressure, and it technically allows us to identify objects that we touch or objects that we grasp. So haptic receptors are both in the deep and superficial skin layers, and they're also attached to the little hairs in our body. Okay, so the next one is proprioception. Proprioception is the perception of body location and body movement. So proprioceptors are encapsulated nerve endings that are sensitive to stretch of our muscles and our tendons, and also whenever we move. So normally we ourselves are unaware of how proprioception contributes to our movements. However, if we lose proprioception due to some injury, it is very difficult to force our body to stay balanced and to move normally. So for proprioception, our body listens carefully to muscle stretch receptors, tendon stretch receptors, and joint movements. Okay, so here you see all the different somatosensory receptors. You can see here's the nociception, apsis, and proprioception. So nociceptors react in response to pain, temperature, and itch, and they react very slow. The stimulus is often damage to the dendrite, and these receptors consist of these little free nerve endings. So apsis receptors react to fine touch and pressure, and they can either respond very slow or fast. So an example of that is, for example, Meissner's corpuscle. It is an example that's important for touch, and you have the little raffinis, which are right here, and those are important for vibrations. So the responses of apsis receptors are either very fast or slow, like I just said. So proprioceptors are important for body awareness, and they react to movement, stretching of the receptors, and they are very important. So what's very important for this is muscle stretches, tendon stretches, and joint movements. They work very, very quick. And yeah, technically you see here, they just react to these three things. So two major somatosensory pathways extend from the spinal cord to the brain. The posterior spinothalamic tract carries apsis and proprioception information, and the anterior part, so the anterior spinothalamic tract, carries information about nociception. So know that the name of these tracts are spinothalamic. This tells us where they come from and where they're going. So these tracts go from the spinal cord all the way up to the thalamus. Okay, so fibers of the somatosensory neurons that make up the apsis and proprioception system are pretty large. They're heavily myelinated, and they adapt pretty quick, so they respond pretty quick. So this pathway is in this picture. You can see it as a solid red line, and this is the posterior spinothalamic tract. So their cell bodies are located in the posterior root ganglia, and the dendrites project to sensory receptors in the body, and their axons project into the spinal cord. So the cell bodies in these nuclei send their axons through the spinal cord to form the medial lemniscus, as you can see right here. And then it ascends to synapse in the ventrolateral thalamus. So it goes all the way up to the thalamus. So then this thalamic nucleus will send projections into the primary somatosensory cortex, or S1, and it also sends it to area 4. So there's a trend going on, like if you can see. So all these sensory systems send information to the thalamus. For the visual system, it sends information to the LGN. In the auditory system, it sends it to the MGN. And in apsis and proprioception, it sends it to the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. Then we have the anterior spinal thalamic tract, and it's important for nociception. So nociceptive fibers are a little smaller, they're less myelinated, and they adapt a little slower than the ones from the previous tract. They follow almost the same course to enter the spinal cord. So as you can see, it's the little dotted line. So they follow the same course as the posterior spinal thalamic tract. But once they get into the spinal cord, they will cross over. So once they're in a spinal cord, they project to relay neurons in a more central region of the spinal cord, and this is called the substantia gelatinosa. So the second relay cells then send their axons across to the other side of the cord, and then they form the anterior spinal thalamic tract. So you can see that here again in the dashed line. So the solid line is the posterior spinal thalamic tract, and the dashed line is the anterior spinal thalamic tract. So the posterior spinal thalamic tract crosses in the midbrain right here. And then the anterior spinal thalamic tract crosses in the spinal cord. So these anterior fibers will eventually join the posterior apsis and proprioception fibers in the medial lemniscus, so they join up right here. And then they will also terminate primarily in the ventrolateral thalamus, but they also have some projections to the posterior thalamus. And then these messages are relayed to S1, or the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so we have the two pathways for somatosensation that take different routes in the brain. So let's do a little recap and use this figure to do so. So let's start off here. So dorsal root ganglion neurons respond to fine touch and pressure, to joint, tendon, and muscle change, and to pain and temperature. Then it goes in. The ventral spinal thalamic tract receives input from pain and temperature, and then joins the pathway called the medial lemniscus. And the dorsal column nuclei relay fine touch and pressure sensations. The medial lemniscus contains axons that carry sensory information to the ventrolateral thalamus. The ventrolateral thalamus relays sensory information to the somatosensory cortex, and then the primary somatosensory cortex receives all this information. Okay, so little recap. Anterior spinal thalamic tract crosses over from left to right in the spinal cord and is important for nociception. The posterior spinal thalamic tract crosses over from left to right in the brainstem and is important for apsis and proprioception. If you have unilateral damage in the spinal cord, so right here, if you cut half the spinal cord, you will get loss of body awareness and a fine touch and pressure below the cut ipsilateral of the body, but you will lose pain and temperature sensation below the cut on the opposite side of the body. Okay, so this doctor called Dr. Wilder Penfield, he created a topographic map that represents the body surface on the primary somatosensory cortex. So the regions representing feeling in the mouth and eyes are more ventral, and then the regions representing hand and finger sensations are in the middle, and then the regions corresponding to the feet are more in the dorsal areas, as you can see right here. So here are the feet, here you have the hand and fingers, and here you have the mouth and the face. So this map is called a homunculus, and it is relative to the sensitivity of body parts by size. So here you have another example. So the mouth and the hands are way more sensitive, so they're projected as bigger compared to, for example, our shoulders. Okay, so let's move on to the vestibular system. So the inner ear contains the organs that allow you to perceive your own motion and to stand upright without losing your balance. So they are super close to the auditory system, so please don't get confused. The vestibular organs contain tiny little hair cells, just like the auditory system, and these hair cells will bend when the body moves forward or when the head changes position relative to the body. So if you're looking down or looking to the side. So here in the image you see a structure that are called the semicircular canals, and they're located right by the cochlea on both sides of the head. So there are technically 3 semicircles, and they are oriented in 3 planes that correspond to the 3 dimensions of which we move. So together they can represent any head movement you might make. And then we have these 2 otolith organs, which are called the utricle and the saccule. So the otolith organs detect the head linear acceleration and responds to changes in head position with respect to gravity. So the semicircular canals are important for head movement, and the otolith organs are sensitive to head static position in space. So fibers from the balance receptors project over to the 8th cranial nerve to a number of nuclei in the brainstem. And these nuclei interact in the hindbrain to help keep us balanced while we move. So they also aid in controlling, eye movements at the level of the midbrain. So through the connections with the cerebellum, information from this vestibular system allows us not only to balance, but also to respond and replay movements that we might have made. Okay, so I wanted to bring up one sensation that is a dysfunction of the inner ear, which is called vertigo. Vertigo is a sensation of dizziness when you're not moving. So this is a dysfunction of your inner ear, and it can be accompanied by nausea and difficulty maintaining balance while walking. So this was the end of the video, and I will see you guys back soon, and then we're going to talk about taste and smell.